Hello and welcome to Signal Lantern, your beacon of freedom for the Northeast. I'm your host Jason, and here with me today is Mike Walsh, a candidate for Attorney General. How you doing today?
I'm doing well, very much. Thank you, sir. Thank you for having me on. I appreciate it enormously.
Absolutely. So you're running in an uncontested race. It's not like the governors where there's three different people throwing their hats, and the only contest is going to be you versus, was it Andrea Campbell?
Yeah, that's right. Me versus the incumbent.
You versus the incumbent. All right. So why don't you give us a background for those who do not know you? If you went to school, where you grew up, that sort of thing.
Sure. So I'm Mike Walsh. I'm a kid from Linfield. I was born and grew up here in Massachusetts. I was homeschooled. I skipped high school. I went straight to college. I graduated at 17 with a bachelor's degree in political science in 2006, and then a law degree in 2010, and then a LLM in 2014, all from Suffolk University. Since I was admitted to the bar, I've been a general practice litigator. I do a little bit of everything, quite a bit of criminal defense and land law at the moment, but I've also done court martials, some civil service cases, some labor cases, and I have a pretty wide portfolio running all the way from corporate espionage and commercial lending type cases to protecting homeowners to protecting gun rights and even some public interest litigation. A little bit of
Wonderful.
everything.
Yeah. So the Keepers movement, as it's called, the sort of movement that I'm building with Keepers of the Revolution, Project Revere, etc., the one sort of litmus test that we hold for different candidates and who we're supporting is whether or not they support sort of Antonin Scalia style constitutional originalism. And if they're generally in favor of the Constitution. Now, given that you're running for, well, it's not the supreme law of the land, but it's in the state of Massachusetts, you're kind of the chief law officer as Attorney General. I would assume that is your position.
Yes, very much so. My law career and the best cases I've ever had have been an expression of trying to make history matter and make sure that people who don't pay attention to it learn from it. I
Mm.
am a huge proponent of the Massachusetts Constitution, even with all of its flaws. I actually am hoping someday to write a book about it. But in the meantime, I was very much influenced in law school, as many of us were, an entire generation of law students who learned constitutional interpretation through Justice Scalia's lens. He made such an indelible mark on it. Even if you don't like him, people write in opposition to him, but there is no doubt that he has definitely put his stamp on the conservative side of judicial interpretation, and he is a giant in his field even after he's gone. He let There are lots of oddities where we have different tests for different constitutional provisions, and only some of them actually explicitly deal with the history and what the framers intended. For example, your Seventh Amendment right to a civil jury trial is entirely dependent on whether the case would have been at law or at equity in 1789 when the document was written. But realistically speaking, knowing the kind of liberty-oriented future they were building for us, you can't address today's problems without knowing how they viewed the world. And that has to be something that we look at not just when we're interpreting the Constitution, but when we're using the Constitution to interpret statutes, when we're interpreting judicial decisions, and when we're applying rules on the ground to people who have to live with them.
Mm. Yeah, funnily enough, I read the John Adams biography by the late David McCulloch before I watched the HBO series. And this was just for funsies for me. I do enjoy learning about that. And I thought it was really telling that he had defended uh, the in the Boston massacre, the people who ended up shooting to the crowd. And I think that small vignette is a little bit about like just how law and like defending the innocent, even if there's high opposition to it.
Absolutely. There are a lot of high principles that even when they ran against the framers thought were important enough to uphold. For example, one of the other great vignettes of John Adams's contribution is that he is, in many ways, almost single-handedly responsible for the Fourth Amendment as we know it, our privacy protections,
Mm.
because he attended, as a young law student, he attended an oral argument in 1764 by James Otis against the writs of assistance. And Adams later wrote when he was old elder statesman post presidency that he later wrote that then and there the liberty of freedom and the spark of the revolution was born in Otis's fiery firebrand rhetoric. And you see Otis railing against government power being used unchecked with no end in sight, no control on it. And then you look at some of the things our state government does and say, wow, we haven't come that far.
Yeah, I actually recently watched a movie called A Great Awakening that was released, and it was about the friendship between, I think, James Whitfield and Ben Franklin, and sort of the religious awakening that preceded the revolution, which is really intriguing. Um, I'd wanted to talk about, yeah, it's slipping my mind right now, so just riff on that until it comes to me.
The scholars tell us that scholars of religion tell us that our history has gone through three major great awakenings, three major revivals of religious fervor. One immediately preceded the Salem witch trials, and so some scholars actually riff heavily against that. There was a major one, as you say, right in Ben Franklin's lifetime, sort of right before the Age of Enlightenment, and then there was another one immediately after the Age of Enlightenment, as it was winding down in the early 1820s and 30s, which actually brought a lot of things that we come to know as important icons in our culture today, like the Christmas tree, for example.
Yeah,
Um,
I remembered what I'd wanted to say. Uh, you were talking about John Adams as an elder statesman, and I forget who to attribute the quote to, but it was something along the lines of politicians think about the next election and statesmen think about the next generation. And that's an important lens to look through when thinking about the political.
It is, and you can add right to that Reagan's quote about liberty never being more than a generation away from extinction, and that's part of the thing that Scalia helped us do was to, if we keep in mind the principles and the battles that our framers were fighting and the world they were trying to create, it will help us apply those principles even to problems they can't imagine. For all that people riff on Justice Scalia and his tiny coachman argument in the Carpenter case, the Carpenter case about tracking people's movements, the fact remains we want our movements to be private, and the framers almost certainly would have. I mean, as much as we ridicule his little coachman analogy, it actually really is spot on. A lot of our safety wasn't so much built in things like the constitutional rhetoric, but the simple inability of people to be followed, or the inability of people to sort through entire libraries of data looking for your information. And
Right.
those old tests are more important to our liberty now than ever before.
Absolutely. So that's a perfect segue because you and I could just riff on history this entire time and it would be great and it would be amazing. I think you and I have very similar, I absorb information like a sponge. But let's talk about the present because there
Sure.
are issues that you were saying the founders could not have possibly envisioned. And the beauty of the Constitution is that they gave the checks and balances, but also an ability to amend the Constitution and I think that that's a really beautiful thing because it's meant to stand the test of time. But let's talk about current issues and focus on the state level as well. Things that are really important to the people as you've gone around campaigning that have come up and are things that you want to address, like day one being Attorney General.
Well, the first and most obvious, and you'll hear it from every Republican candidate in the entire across the whole slate, is the legislative audit. I take a slightly different approach to most folks because I think that there is a great constitutional battle to be had, but we haven't gotten there. So the legislature, if you strip away all the politics of the day, they argue that they have a legislative privilege against coughing up their records or disclosing their deliberations. And there are legislative privileges expressly written into both the federal and state constitution, but we're so mired in the procedure and the politics that we haven't gotten to this grand battle of the rights of our constitutional auditor versus the constitutional privilege of our legislature. Let's have that discussion. Let's put all the marbles on the table. Let's bring the best advocates and the best arguments, and let's have it out. But right now, we haven't gotten there because the Attorney General is so busy playing, if you pardon the expression, chicken shit games about whether the auditor can even have an attorney or even get on the field. It's almost like if you were a baseball or a soccer team and you kept the other team off the field and then you announced that you win by default because the other team didn't show up.
Yeah. And I will say something that perhaps, a bunch of voters will look at me and be like, shame, shame. But I actually didn't vote for the audit. Um, I love how Massachusetts puts out these little booklets ahead of election season, specifically about the ballot questions. Because oftentimes ballot questions can be formatted in a weird way where if you vote no, it actually means the thing gets passed, and
Hmm.
vice versa, and it can be confusing. And so the booklet was illuminating and it had arguments for and against. And I read it, and one of the things was there is a constitutional separation of powers issue about the legislature and the auditor kind of being under executive scope. There should be a separation of powers. Now, if I were to go back, I'd probably change my vote to vote for the audit, but everyone at events will be like, raise your hand if you voted for the audit, and I kind of just have to stand there and look at my feet.
So don't feel bad. There is a major question, and that's actually part of the reason I think the Attorney General deserves a great knock. Because before she wants to go into court for the auditor, she's arguing that the auditor needs to articulate answers to these grand constitutional questions that even the courts haven't addressed yet. And having your requiring your client to come up with answers to open questions, major questions of constitutional law before we even know where the courts are going to come down. That's basically trying to say no without getting tagged for it politically. To answer your question, that's going to be a grand battle royale, and I hope the SJC gets to it. I'm afraid at this point they're not likely to get to it before the election. There are a couple of other similar issues that are coming up, believe it or not. Like, for example, there's what I've been calling Audit 2.0. There's a ballot question that the auditor sponsored to try and subject the legislature to the Public Records Act. And that's a lot closer to legislative privilege. The state Supreme Court actually is taking amicus briefs on it and the audit case, and they're going to argue it about 2 days after the audit case. And
Hmm.
we're all waiting with bated breath. I wouldn't want to handicap it, but my professional opinion is that while Audit 1.0 probably is going to pass legislative privilege, I think Audit 2.0 is going to get struck down, and I think the voters are going to be really mad about that.
Well, just a lot more. I mean, I think it kind of comes down to transparency of you can hide behind all the constitutional issues and that sort of thing, but there is a level of shady behavior. And I think that the state level is often overlooked for presidential and federal senate and state and the state reps, the state senators. I mean, I'm running for town moderator. I think that those roles, it's really the spirit of the 10th amendment of like given to the states in the jurisdiction thereof. So i I want there to be more attention paid because I would assume that the constitutional way to deal with someone being intransigent and not transparent would be voting them out of office.
Yep, no, you're quite right. That certainly is the most basic, easy, and civic-minded approach to the whole matter, rather than feisting with lawsuits and whatnot. But and it's kind of funny, believe it or not. There's this brilliant quote from this mid-Atlantic statesman in the mid to early 20th century, and he said he was remarking on New England men, and he said that the reason all these New England men were so well educated, they were in the issues of the day, they knew it was because they had spent their youth being trained in civics by town meeting, and he was arguing. I forget the name of the quote, and I'll get it for you. But essentially, it was arguing that town meeting on a very local level, when we're dealing with our local budgets, help train us to view the issues of the day, see both sides, and understand a broader picture than our own checkbook. And it's he's not wrong. I love Town Meeting Time. It's a great book.
Yeah. So, I mean, the sort of so-called boring procedures are things that are really interesting to me. And what I found out about moderator, I mean, we're using this more as a going up from municipal onward and telling people, hey, you should care about municipal stuff. This is more a shameless plug for your election, not mine. But I did find something interesting that the town moderator is actually like tied with the sheriff and the governor as like the oldest positions in the United States back when they were colonies. The first
Yes.
recorded town meeting was Dorchester 1633, Boston 1634, and so it like predates the United States by 140 years.
Yep. It does. Because this is where we came together. Did you ever hear about the Revolution of 1634? It's one of my favorite tidbits of history.
Sure.
So
Enlighten me.
Governor Winthrop and his colleagues, who were a little bit more white collar than the Plymouth colonists, when they got their corporate charter from the king, they weren't supposed to take it out of the hands of England. So they literally smuggled the physical charter all the way into Boston. They brought it to the New World, and then they spent 80 years refusing to give it up. By the way, when the king tried to revoke it, but one of the things is that all of a sudden they decided they feared Spanish attack. So the governor and his councilmen were going around and demanding that every one of the settlers and the farmers cough up money. And so all of a sudden, the moment people were asked to reach in their checkbook, everyone was mad as can be, and they immediately asked, "Where's your authority to do that?" And so it took them almost a year and a half to convince the governor to actually show them the charter. And when he showed them the charter, it didn't say the governor could do that. And so that's actually, believe it or not, the start of the legislature. Is that it was agreed that the colony in just 4 years had grown to be too complex and too difficult to be governed by an assembly of all of the free men, and so they agreed to send representatives and delegates on a regular basis. That's actually the origin of the General Court. But there's this whole revolution. They literally voted Winthrop out of office and replaced him with his deputy. I think it was Andros, but don't quote me. Or no, Dudley. I'm sorry. But they literally, there was a whole assembly of all the free men, and they marched in, and they didn't want to pay the taxes, and they said, "Where are you getting the authority and the right to strip us of our money?" And that's actually
Hmm.
the start of the General Court and the first oldest elected legislature in the Western Hemisphere, I believe.
I suppose they say that history doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes. We're talking about the audit, and it's like, where do you get the authority to uh, hide behind the shady stuff? And a lot of just back and forth drama, actually. It's kind of fun. Here's my idea. We talk about taxes, right? And obviously they call us Taxachusetts. I prefer Marxachusetts. That's a certified Jason original.
You
You
got it.
got California, Marxachusetts. It would be something that I feel like Trump could say, like Marxachusetts. Um, but I mean, we fought a bloody, violent revolution over what was like a 3% tax. Okay,
Yep.
uh, I have a perfect idea for energy policy. Is we should there's an abundant source of free energy that we are not utilizing is the founding fathers rolling over in their graves. We can hook up stuff to it and start generating power by how fast they're rolling over in their graves because of all the taxes.
Isn't it amazing? And you're not wrong that it wasn't just a 3% tax. It was a penny tax on the tea, but it was the principle. I think our framers, in some ways, may have been smarter than we were because it wasn't just about the dollars and the cents. It was about, and much for all that England, it was important to keep that one little tax on the symbol. It was just as important to the framers to say, no, we object to the principle. It doesn't matter that it's only a penny. We're still going to fight for it. We're going to risk life, liberty, property, bloodshed. We're going to risk undoing our colonies. We're going to risk war with mother country. We're going to fight the biggest army on the earth. And it's not about a penny tea tax. It's about a principle.
And I think that's one thing that is a little unique. I mean, there's like, oh, Democrat, Republican, and if Andrea Campbell wants to come on this show, I'd be happy to have her. We are nonpartisan.
Totally get it.
Um, but I think that what I've found is when the side that's calling, oh, for the principle is not the side currently in power.
Invariably. Matter of fact, I think that's going to be one of the hardest things, both for myself and for the gubernatorial and lieutenant governor candidates, is if we actually get power, and it's a little unlikely, but I think this is a pretty good year, so we've got a good shot. We need to be able to, after having articulated criticisms and principles, we need to be better and we need to deliver, and that's the hard work of governing. And I'm hoping we can convince the voters that we're good enough to try.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what's important, I mean, there is so many registered independents or unaffiliated, unenrolled, as it were, people in Massachusetts who you kind of don't really know where they lie. And so it's appealing to the middle can be an important strategy, but it just me personally, I don't appeal to the middle in policy, in sacrificing and compromising my principles, rather more in temperament. I've always had the temperament of an independent when it comes to engaging with people, and the best way to preserve a right is by practicing it and offering free speech. So
Absolutely.
tell me about um, that and how you relate to that.
Sure. So I am a free speech absolutist. I'm all in, and I believe very strongly in the First Amendment. Not just the free
You're
speech
not just
clause.
saying that. You're
I'm
not
not
just
just
saying
saying
okay.
that. If you want to Google me, there's a case I took up against my town, just not for profit, just civic responsibility to try and enforce the open meeting law when they were hiring. Our select board was hiring candidates, and so they'd have one selectman sitting in each room, and then just walk the candidates in a round robin through the rooms. And I felt that deprived the voters of their right for information and the right to see the deliberation of their officials. And I thought it was deliberate undermining the open meeting law. It turns out that the appeals court didn't agree with me, but you can look it up. It's actually 3 registered voters versus the town of Linfield. They didn't agree with me, but since the legislature rewrote the law about 6 months later, we ultimately took a victory, if not in the courts. I am a huge free speech advocate. I work very hard for it. I believe very strongly in it, and it's important. And free speech is amazing because when you talk, have you ever read Alexis de Tocqueville?
I've heard of it. It's on my to be read list that is like a
Sorry.
mile long.
Ah, so Alexis de Tocqueville was passingly familiar with the Marquis de Lafayette, and you know that Lafayette came after the French Revolution in his old age and was touring the colonies and receiving lots of celebrations and fiats. He was actually welcomed in the Massachusetts State House. In fact, there's a story about it in the tour. But with him came Alexis de Tocqueville, who was one of the first real political scientists, and he was trying to
Mm.
study, now that the republic was coming into its early middle age, how was it doing, how was it functioning, and his work is still really one of the definitive political science works. But one of the parts I always loved is he remarked that you can walk into any bar or any tavern in any town, and everyone has got a criticism of the government, and they freely speak it and they believe it, and you can strike up a conversation with any American in any of the 13 colonies because they always have stories about how some level of government, be it state, local, or federal, has done something awful and aggressive, and they've had to fight back and keep their liberty. And Tocqueville was saying that perhaps one of the most amazing things about America was the widespread cultural distrust of the government and the willing to stand and fight for your rights. And I think that flame is still here in our culture. It's a little harder to recognize, but I think it's still there because you can talk with people that you don't agree with on issues and still find common examples. My favorite example was a really insightful criticism of environmental policy.
Hmm.
And this gentleman was drawing a distinction between environmentalists and conservationists. And he was arguing that conservationists are right leaning people who want to protect clean water, but they want to protect beautiful species so they can go out and hunt them. But here's the thing, the hunters can actually get together with the environmentalists on a lot of issues like clean water and let's protect the habitat. And then we can fight on the narrow 2% of stuff we don't agree with as long as we keep talking to each other. And that's what the First Amendment and that Tocqueville's distrust of government really allow us to come together if we can stop tripping on our own shoelaces.
Yeah, that's a really interesting thing because I remember it was the American Conservation Coalition, and they do a lot of good work, and they're trying to reclaim and be like, "Hey, listen, conservatives don't have to just retreat on climate policy. Like, conservation, conserve is in the word conservative, and actually putting forth a bunch of policy for uh, common sense I'm a huge proponent of nuclear, but I know that's kind of falls outside the scope of attorney general a little bit.
A little bit, but it's not bad to discuss and to remember that Teddy Roosevelt, for example, was the one who started the National Park Service and started preserving these beautiful pieces of history and pieces of natural landscape for us to see. So there's no reason that Republicans should be surrendering that ground to Democrats.
Yeah,
You're
and I'm
quite
an
right
Eagle
about that.
Scout, so I love the
Same here.
outdoors and I love congrats. Well, let's talk about speaking of the outdoors, chapter 135. Um there's a whole hubbub surrounding it. What was even the deal with how that got passed? And, you know, I wasn't following it too closely. I just knew it was a shameless gun grab by our tyrant,
Oh,
I mean,
yep.
Governor Maura Healey.
Well, you've got the gist of it. So the Supreme Court came down a couple of years ago in a case called Brune versus the New York versus New York, and they held that basically they abolished the constitutional distinction between these may issue states and these shall issue states. And since we were
Mm,
a may issue state, at least part of it. We had to reform our laws. But it won't surprise you that some of our most liberal senators came out and said, "Let's modernize the laws and let's reform the laws to comply with the horrible Supreme Court decision in Brune." And then, of course, they stuck every anti-gun proposal you can imagine there. And in the name of fairness, I have to say that there are some potentially good things in there. One of the things that they wanted to regulate was ghost guns, which are guns that you could basically they're plastic guns that you can anyone can print with a 3D printer in their basement, and they don't have enough metal content to be detected when you're going through a metal detector, like at a big event or on an airport or what have you. And I can sort of recognize that maybe those should be treated the same as regular guns. They should be numbered, and you should have to have a license to carry them, probably. But in the middle of that tiny kernel of a good idea of trying to modernize and maybe looking at the 3D printing technology, they added in a whole bunch of garbage that is specifically and explicitly designed to harm people who like guns, people who have guns, and people who make guns. It is a shameless policy grab. They literally had a good reason, and they just couldn't resist making political use of an emergency. That's what it came down to. And it's topped off by the fact that, as you probably know, Toby Leary and his whole civil rights coalition, John Wahany and Kevin Dewey, they went out and they collected 95,000 signatures under our state constitution. There are two levels of a referendum, and if you get double the number of signatures, you're allowed to actually stop a bad law the legislature has passed from going into effect. In this case, the legislature didn't enact an emergency preamble, so he actually was going to be entitled to suspend the law until the voters had their say, which I think is pretty democratic. And then all of a sudden, the governor, with one stroke of a pen, less than a day before he submitted his signatures, decided, oh, he's going to make it. And she signed an emergency declaration and literally undid the suspension. He went to all this trouble to get double the signatures, and she undid it with a stroke of a pen just because she doesn't like government. And her half-assed excuse, if you pardon the expression, was that oh well we're not going to be we need to start deploying curriculums for the firearms training courses. And then, of
Hmm.
course, she signed the declaration. And then months later, Toby and some of his group actually managed through public records request to get records that say that even though the emergency declaration had now gone into effect, they still weren't complying with their own reasons for the emergency. So it was a shameless political power grab, exactly as you say.
Yeah,
They were
well,
openly abusing the powers in a most incredible way.
that doesn't sound half-assed to me. That sounds full-assed. And when I say that, I mean the Democratic Party as a donkey as their symbol. So,
Yep, nope, spot on. Spot on.
okay, so I mean, a lot of people get gun rights confused because they're like, oh, it's so confusing, and they say, necessary for there's this whole separation of clauses where people will argue it's for the militia specifically and being necessary for a free state, and that doesn't mean, and they separate it, but you have to read it as a whole.
Yep,
So
absolutely. And
what
Justice
exactly does that mean and was interpreted to mean?
So the way Justice Scalia was able to read it in D.C. versus Heller, he said that the first clause about the militia being necessary for the common defense is a declaratory clause. It's saying why you have the right and potentially a guide to how it should be interpreted, but it doesn't grant the right and it doesn't limit the right. The actual granting of the right is that the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. That's your right to keep a gun at home. That's the right to carry the gun out in the street for your protection, and it's the right to keep protections for self-defense. And in DC versus Heller, the Supreme Court, led by I believe Justice Scalia, held that civil self-defense in the home with a handgun was perhaps the core of the right. We actually have a very similar clause in our own state constitution's Declaration of Rights, Article 17, which we've more or less gutted. But one of the important historical analogs that kind of gets missed is that at the time the militia constituted every able-bodied man, whether or not you were freeman. Even slaves were subject to conscription in the military. And believe it or not, if you read Chapter 33 which is the state National Guard provision, you and I are still being less than, I think, 80 and over 18. Basically, still, all free, able-bodied men are still subject to conscription as the unorganized militia. And I know some of the law articles that have been written about that over the years have been thought to be a little edgy and conspiracy theory and what have you. But the fact remains the statutes are there and the historical practice was there that if there ever really was an emergency, we'd expect everyone to pitch in. And if it was the kind of emergency that required self-defense, we'd expect you to bring your self-defense weapon to the defense of the common good.
Yeah, and when they say well regulated, I mean how they said well regular. I mean, they meant that as, do you know how to use the gun? That when they said
Right.
regular, that's what the word meant in that context.
They used to have for every free man in every town. They used to have a regular quarterly drill that you had to come out and show to the sergeant or the captain and the lieutenant that you knew how to basically run your musket. It actually irritated as the merchant class was growing in the 1720s and 30s. It actually started to irritate them that they were subject to coming out because they didn't have as much practice as the hunters and the farmers, and they still had to come out and show they knew how to use the rifle and everything else, if only to protect themselves. But it is what it is.
Hi there, future Jason. At this point in the conversation, a phone call occurred where he didn't have to leave. It just briefly paused the recording, unbeknownst to me, as we spoke for another 29 minutes, double the length of what you've just saw. His end was not recording. So rather than subjecting you to a lot of spaces of silence, me nodding or laughing, and then asking another question for the next 29 minutes, I figured I'd give a rough recap. First and foremost, he was talking about how the merchants were upset with the farmers, and his thought that he finished was, it was a bit of drama because, like, why are you making us do gun drills? We're merchants and we're not as trained as those farmers. But we went on and spoke about. I had asked him if there were any other issues apart from these hot button issues, like the Chapter 135 or the audit, that were important and things that citizens should know more about. And he had said, you know what, home rule actually is something people need to know more about. And I'm familiar with it reading Town Meeting Time. And so, believe it or not, citizens can actually file for a home rule petition. Things that are outside of the jurisdiction of the town, they're able to file to the state legislature to grant special permissions to a municipality in order to have that power. And so there is a unique way where towns are able to deal with this, and it's actually really interesting. But there's a lot of power that goes to the town. And when we're talking about federalism and the 10th Amendment, this is all the way down to the most micro level. The most interactive way us citizens can be involved is in through town and local governance. And home rule is just one of those mechanisms. And while he was saying, we have to protect it from overreach and being preempted by the judiciary, um, my approach, I had suggested, and he agreed that, hey, you know what? We should have a larger movement where citizens are more aware of their power and more able to exercise it in a democratic way, which was really exciting and something that I would want to do. Then we went on and I had asked him, okay, let's say you're the attorney general right now and you get elected. What does it look like? And I commented that the best candidates for office don't just like get elected and then, like, okay, what now? It's like, no, you're researching and studying as if you're actually doing the role. And so he was saying of all the different things he'd do, signing a referendum to uh, allow for the audit to happen, and a bunch of other things on his list that were, legalese that he would probably describe better than me. But he had a plan. It wasn't just a, I'm going to get elected because I want power. And generally, talking to Mike, it seemed to me that he has a high respect for the process and the law rather than partisan agendas like Andrea Campbell. Uh, the judiciary is not meant to overpower and push through laws. It is meant to be that arbiter between things. And he gave the example of a case where, let's say there is an unpopular law that is passed. I, as attorney general, have to stand in front of you as possibly angry citizens and say, well, sorry, this is how it went. Even if we know didn't, or even if we all know that OJ did it, we have to respect what the jury says. We have to respect the law. And so I'm very much of that same mind. He's a constitutional originalist in the Scalia style, someone who is very deeply knowledgeable about the subjects. And from what little it means, I do fully and completely endorse Mike Walsh for Attorney General. One thing he said you can do to help, go to mikewalshforag.com. That will be linked down below. It'll have more about what he's standing for and what he wants to do and his platform, as it were. Furthermore, he had said that as a candidate, take any microphone that's given to you, which means putting your message out there for people who agree with you, people who disagree with you. And so he said, if you can get an event of like 5, 10 people, I'll come and I'll speak for it. So if you're a local committee or a civic group or a college club that is interested in law or politics or really anything, this guy's a walking encyclopedia. Definitely reach out to him through his website, try to book an event, and he'd be more than happy to come. I again, I apologize for the fact that technical difficulties got in the way, but Mike is definitely a really good candidate, and I've completely endorse him. Please be sure to spread the signal, and shameless plug for our locals. If you have not known already, we do have a locals, signallantern.locals.com, where not only will you know the guests ahead of time, and you will also be able to ask questions and have releases of our episodes, but you will also have access to an unfiltered podcast we're starting called Bonfire, where it's really just our unhinged hot takes with me, Remy, and Matt, or any combination of us, where it's, not self censoring and just saying all those controversial hot takes, which Matt is really good at. And for me, it takes a little bit more poking and prodding. So please go, it's signallantern.locals.com, also linked below, and be sure to spread the signal. Thank you very much.